Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, we're on page 1391. We're 3/4 down the page. And in explaining Bria Yetzira, with Bria being like the level of Toihu, Igulim, which means there's something that exists, but it's still in a state of me, like Bina. Me. Who? We have the question. But as the Parda says, it's already Haskolas Dover Ma. She yipul by Ashayla Leimer. So you already have the emergence of something, of an idea, a concept, and therefore where you can apply the question, what is it? Or who is this? Mihuzeh. Even if you don't yet have an answer to the question. And then afterwards, the Pardes writes, I'm summing up from the beginning of the paragraph on page 1391, then the meaning of amuk v'sasum, what means something is deep or submerged and concealed and closed up, because kfar nisava, Chachma, Bina has already been formed. It's already emerged from Chachma. Omnam ha'avayi amuka, but it's still in a state that it's submerged and in amuka b'bchinas ha'chachma, still buried or submerged within Chachma. Because there's chabrus of Chachma and Bina. And that's called amokim, the depths, stuma, and you can't call it by a name that defines it, hamachayiv be'in chiyuv klal, which defines and somewhat the parameters, hamagbil adover begeder inyan ma, that defines it in some parameters that can be grasped, that can be defined. So it's on the gedder of me, not who is this, and that's like toyu, like we said before, where you cannot give it a name yet or a description. Well, if the Rebbe Rashab concludes, yetaken lema b'chinas bria v'yitzira. So according to this explanation of these stages, we can understand Bria Yetzira is like makif Pnimi, Igulim and Yesher, with the Bria being the level of Toyu, which is a state of Helam, and Yesher is Gilui. So at Helam, and Yesher is Gilui, and Igulim, Bria is like a Helam. Or in the higher levels, the two higher levels in Keser, with one level being Atik, completely removed, and Arich, which is something that exists, but it's still elusive, it's still beyond existence itself. That's what we conclude. That's where we stop. The Rebbe Rashab is going to continue, and just the last line that we learned was this: that's like the lower level of Keser, Arich, shu b'chinas seva v'helam. Seva is makif, meaning it's not internalized or integrated, but it's there. And v'helam, it's a state of helam, but it's a helam that you can still say, I know it's there, I just don't know what's there, but I know it's there. On the lower level, that's Bina, and even lower that's the world of Bria. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that we see it's Bria, it's Bina, Natzilus, and it's Arich and Keser, because that's how Ishtalshalos works. Everything in the lower levels exists in a more subtle form in the higher levels. So Bina compared to Chachma is like Bria compared to Atzilus. Arich compared to Atik is like Bina compared to Chachma, or in the case here, like Yetzira, like Bria compared to, which is higher than Toyu, Ephes, as we learned earlier. Okay. Now the Rebbe Rashab says a Yesh Lemer before he goes back to Yetzira. V'yesh Lemer, I'm going to read now inside the line that begins V'yesh Lemer, parentheses, several lines. It's only a 4-line, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4-line parentheses. And the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow along the text. Okay. V'yesh Lemer, you can say, and here the Rebbe Rashab again broadens. Remember, I've been explaining that all these different levels is really expanding the topic for more than just being Bria Yetzira, but you see this in the entire cosmic order in many different dimensions. So now he adds to that. And what does he say? V'yesh Lemer al pi ma shekosav b'mishnas Chasidim b'mesechta klolos ha'el misreish perik beis. Okay. So Mishras Chassidim is yet another Kabbalistic work. So I'm one of the students of the students of the Arizal. Mishras Chassidim was his name was Amnual Chai Reiki. He's another Italian Makubal, and this is from the Kabbalah that's sometimes associated with somewhat not completely, but Yisrael. Excuse me. Rabbi Yisrael Sarug, which was another student of the Arizal, and we once discussed this at length. It's like he introduces the concept of Rishimu, Shashua Melech Batzmuse, ideas that the teachings of Rabbi Yisrael Sarug. Chassidus ultimately brings it together with Rabbi Chaim Vital. But at the time, it was two different schools of thought, to the point that some did not recognize that anyone but Rabbi Chaim Vital could be the one that passes on the Kisvei Arizal. But the fact of the matter is that the Alter Rebbe brings Mishras Chassidim many times and says that even though it's coming from, and the Rebbe says that even though it came from the different school of thought, that the Alter Rebbe already showed that it all is part of Kisvei Arizal, all part of that body. So Mishras Chassidim has his sefer is divided in mesechtes, like tractates. Mesechta Klolos Se'elim Reish Perek Beis. So what does he say there? He says the Ak Huseda Arich Shel Kol Ha'elim Abya. Okay, so this is something you may have heard, you may have learned. It's not. It's used quite. You can find it quite a number of times throughout Chassidus. The Ak Adam Kadmon, which is the first world of all worlds, what we call sometimes the blueprint, Seker Beskira Achas, where the entire existence, the entire Seder Shtash is encompassed in Ak. So he says, Ak is Seid HaArich, is the Seid, is a word used like Seid HaTzimtzum, like the doctrine. But Seid also means the secret of Arich, Shel Kol Ha'elim Abya. It's the Arich, the central Arich of all the worlds of Atzilus B'ri Yitzir Asiyah. And it's actually brought this Mishras Chassidim Huva B'Lekutei Torah Ba'abir D'Meitzeihem. So this in the Lekutei Torah of the Alter Rebbe is brought in Maseh. It's a Maimer in Maseh. In the beer, he brings this Mishras Chassidim. Let me just explain what it means. Remember, a principle in Kabbalah in general, in Torah in general, Kabbalah and Chassidus in particular, is the concept of Olam Katan Zeh Adam. We'll call it microcosm, macrocosm, like a hologram. Everything exists in both microcosmic form and a macrocosmic form. Similar to when we talk about, for example, DNA, that even the smallest cell, even the smallest the smallest iota of a human body has the entire DNA that all the body has. So microcosm, macrocosm means that in the microcosm, you can have the worlds of Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah, but there's also in the macrocosm. Like we told, Atzilus the Klolos. In macrocosm is the 10 hidden spheres before the Tzimtzum, with Malchus of Ein Sof being the lowest level there. Bria the Klolos is Ak. Yitzira the Klolos in macrocosm is either Atik and Arich Keser or Akudim and Nekudim and Toyu. And Asiyah the Klolos in macrocosm is Atzilus Bri Yitzira Dasiyah in microcosm. So the same idea with Keser. Even though there's a Keser for each world, which Keser really means the Rotzen, the desire for each world, but then there's a desire for all desires in the macrocosm. So what he says here, that Arich is Arich of, generally speaking, is the Keser of Atzilus. So the Keser of Atzilus, before you get to Chochmah of Atzilus, you have Atik and Arich, the Tainug and Rotzen of the two levels of Keser. But in Mishnas Chassidim, he's adding that Ak is the Arich of Klolos Abya. So if you look at the whole picture, Ak is like the Keser, the lower level of Keser of all of Hishtalshlus, or what he calls Kol Ha'elim Abya. And why is that the case? Because Adam Kadmon, the world of Adam Kadmon, encompasses all Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiyah. Just like Arich, the Keser of Atzilus, encompasses all of Atzilus. So just to use a very practical Balabatish example, let's say you have a hierarchy in a company or in the military. So you have the commander-in-chief. Okay, he's on top of everyone. He has generals below him. Those generals, they're 5-star generals, 4-star generals, 3-star generals. The generals have beneath them the colonels, the sergeants, etc., etc., as it works its way down the hierarchy, all the way to each particular, what's the word for it? Not battalion, each particular group. What do you call a group in military? Each particular, not department, whatever it may be. Okay. There's a word, squadron. Now, each regiment, yeah. Each group has its leader. There's a sergeant that leads them. The sergeant has on top of him someone bigger, and so on. So you could speak about this also in context of microcosm, macrocosm. If someone says, who's the leader? The answer is, if you're talking, who's the leader of our group? It's going to be the sergeant of this group. Who's the leader of all the groups? It's the commander-in-chief. So they all have something in common, that there's a leader, but there's the leaders of the smaller sections, like the head of a department. The heads of departments answer to the head of all the departments. The head of all departments answers all the way to the COO or the CEO, all the way back to the chairman and to the top leadership. So in that context, you could have also a microcosm, macrocosm. So the idea that each world has its keser, each world has its rotzen that runs that world, the rotzen of Atzilus, of keser of Bria. But then there's the keser that's all encompassing, and that's Arich. That's Ak, rather. So Ak is the Arich of Kol Ha'elam Abiyah. The Rebbe Rashab is building with this to explain why the level, what he said before about being Seva V'Helam. We'll soon see. So he continues. Yeshlemer. The Yeshlemer says that Rabbi Shami, you can say the Kamoikenu Ba'elam Habriya. Same is true with Elam Habriya. She'akelo Kol Ma Shenisava Ba'elam is Biyah. The same with Elam Habriya. Bria has an element that encompasses everything that will come from it, all the worlds of Biyah. Now he doesn't say it explicitly, but Ak is Bria the Klolos. So this just adds to understand the point that Bria is like a level that encompasses everything, and then Yetzirah is where it begins to take on shape and details. So that's what he's saying. So Bria is also Kel Ma Kol Ma Shenisava Be'elam is Biyah, Ba'ayim Ma Shenisbar Le'il Be'inyan Da'ak Hu Tchila Se'esavos. And look at what we discussed earlier, was explained earlier, that Ak is the beginning of creation, which in a way is essentially the concept of Bria. Doesn't say the word Bria, but that's what it means. So what do we derive from this is a further elaboration how the world of Bria that we've been talking about is a type of, like we said, like a seed, where it's still an amorphous entity that's not yet been shaped, and everything is within it, but yet not defined yet. So it exists. You can't call it doesn't exist. It's Bria, like we said, like Bina. Something has emerged, but it's still in a state of concealment, like we spoke about before. So that's Arich, the level of Toyu. A higher level is Ephes. There, like Reshad Atik, Reshad that's beyond. That's beyond. You can't even call it Tchilas Seisavos. You can't call it the beginning of something. It's not even that raw piece of clay in the analogy that has not yet been shaped. Here we're talking about there's something there, but it's still an all-encompassing entity, so it's Igulim. That's why it's an Igul. It's a Makif, like he called it before the parentheses. It's Makif and Helam, Seva v'Helam. So Bria is a Nikra Toyu Kamei B'chinas Arich, and the parentheses adds to explain why Bria and Arich have something in common, because Ak is the Arich of all Ishtalshlos, and Ak is Bria, the Klolos, in macrocosm. And so too is it a microcosm. So bottom line, you have this level everywhere through Ishtalshlos. It begins with Ak, Bria the Klolos. It then is Arich in Keser. It's Bina in the spheres, and it's Bria in the worlds of the microcosm, Bria compared to Atzilus and leading down to Yetzirah and so on. That's the parentheses. Any questions about that? About this parentheses?
I have one question. We used to define Ak as a map, and it seems the opposite of a map. If it's a bria, it's an amorphous thing. It's like, how do you reconcile that?
Well, a map is just an analogy. A map means that everything is encompassed in it in a concentrated form. So it's not a map like a physical paper map.
I got it.
That means that everything that will come is originates there. So you can call it like a Heyuli. You can call it as a yeah. The truth is, it's a map from God's perspective. If you looked at Ak, you wouldn't see a map. You would just see a raw piece of matter, so to speak. But in it, like a seed, has everything that will come from it. Yeah. Good. Like when we say that everything in Ashgacha Pratis, even when a leaf turns over, it says all originates in Machshava Gduma Da'ak. Because God, was He envisioned all of time and space, it's all in Ak, but it's all in a very concentrated and in a Bria form. It's not Yitzira, like he says, and now he continues. Yitzira hu b'chinas hagili. Yitzira is the level of Gilui, where it now is emerging in some form of revelation, some expression. Okay, that's that. Now these two levels, Bria, Yitzira, is V'hu, B'chinas Alma Diskasya. He's now introducing yet another term. The hidden worlds, which is Bria, the Alma Dizgalia, the revealed worlds, which is Yitzira. So now you see again, the Rebbe Rashab is doing what I said. He's showing how this theme really applies in so many different areas in the Shtalshlus and in the ideas of Chassidus. Okay. And now he goes back to the point he made at the beginning of the paragraph. So just for context purposes, in a way, he concluded what he started saying in Yesh Lahoyer. If you go back to the third line in the previous page of the new paragraph, it says, Yesh Lahoyer meaning Gulim v'Yesher. This all was a Gulim v'Yesher. I would say he concludes that section. And now he goes back to what he said there. If you look at the beginning of the paragraph, he says the same letters. He says, Ima Yes. Look at the beginning of the last paragraph in the last page. Ima Yes. That the sasum, that which is concealed and closed up, is higher than the Gilui. That's very clear. Anything that can be it's a higher level. Like he said there, it's higher than the Gilui. The quality of revealing something has a virtue and something superior about it, something special about it, more than that which is concealed. Because the intention, what he means here is the divine intention, the purpose of it is that it shouldn't remain concealed, that it should be revealed. This is almost similar to what he said back where he said the same thing there, that because because there he added the word tachlis hakavana. The ultimate purpose is Gilui. Here he just says the kavana is Gilui. But this line tells you he's reconnecting the ideas to where he was back on the previous page. So this whole section from Yesh Lahoyer to what we just finished about Ak, and I'm sorry, where we finished about Bri Yitzir being like Yigulim and Yesher is an elaboration within that, and now he's coming back to the theme that he was speaking about earlier about Yetzer Eira Boyra Cheshach, the quality of Yetzirah over Bria, even though Bria is a higher level. I'm saying it simply to create structure here. So Gul and V'Yesha, the topic has been concluded about the Makif and the Pnimi. Now we're back to Bria Yetzirah. Okay. Now the next parenthesis is the plot thickens. Before we read it, let me just give a small introduction. Remember, we spoke earlier about Atik and Arich, that one is a concealment, but it's something that you know it's there, you just don't know what's there. Like just like the consciousness of a human being tells you that the consciousness comes from somewhere, it's me. You don't know who it is. Who is it? Who is this entity it's coming from? Then there's a level that you don't even know that it exists. It's completely unknowable. Now, logically and intuitively, you would think like this. The level that's completely unknowable is completely beyond us altogether. The level that's concealed is closer to us, but not yet in a way that we can internalize it or relate to it. It's emerged, but it's not yet shaped like Yetzirah. And then comes Gilui, Yetzirah, where we begin to see the shape and form, and it starts taking on shape and form until it comes Asiya, a final product. Similar to, for example, the moment before conception of a new child. So that's something that's completely beyond us. We don't know where was that soul before it became part of the beginning of the cell when there was a conception. And then begins one cell, at least you have a cell. The cell, on the other hand, is something of substance, but it's still mysterious. To see one cell, it's a combination of the male and the female seed and egg that was fertilized, it still remains completely amorphous. We know it's there, and we know every child originated there, but it's mysterious. It's the level of mystique of beyond us. But it's still closer than that which preceded that. In other words, when God decided that He's sending a soul down below, and the child and the newborn, the new fetus wasn't yet conceived, that's completely beyond, relatively speaking. I'm just using it as an example. And then comes the development of the child until after 9 months, a child is born. So you have Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya. And then you have that which is beyond Bria. In this parenthesis, he's going to bring it back to a theme that goes back all the way to volume 1. I mentioned it, of the two levels of Sasum. Sasum legabe hagili, which means it's concealed relative to the revelation, it's concealed. But it's not fundamentally removed. Then Sasum be'etzem. Then something that's completely forever, completely beyond our comprehension and grasp. And what he's going to say is that, interestingly, it is that higher level that in some ways is even beyond concealment. It's not shot that it's concealed to the point we can't see it. It's beyond level of concealed and revelation. So in a way, we have more access to it even than the level that's concealed. Because if something is concealed, there's a deliberate effort to conceal it. But if something is not concealed, it's something beyond revelation and concealment. So yes, you don't have access to it with logic and with our integrated tools, but there's something about it that you can have more access than something that's concealed. Let's read it inside. So he says like this: the Efsher, and perhaps, this is the Rebbe Rashab saying Efsher. The Frierdiker Rebbe pointed out a number of times that when my father says maybe, perhaps, I say for sure. In other words, the Rebbe Rashab was saying Efsher. And many Maimorim, the Frierdiker Rebbe, when he would quote this, he would take out the Ve'efsher. He would just make it as a fact. But the Rebbe Rashab says Ve'efsher. And perhaps you can say, Shebesosum yesh hefresh bebeis b'chinas hastimis. In Sosum itself, when something is sealed, Sosum means sealed. It's closed up. That there's a difference between two levels of stimis, two types of covering, two types of concealments. B'chinas Sosum etzad atzmei, one that's concealed on its own. It's fundamentally in a concealed state. In other words, it defies revelation. Ubei and v'sosum, and the second is sosum etzad hamakablim. It's relative. From the point of view of the recipients, it's closed off. But it's not mitzad atzmei. It's not fundamentally removed from, doesn't defy revelation. It's just from the recipients. Just like a teacher is teaching an idea, they're the things he reveals, and the things that he does not reveal. That remains concealed from the students. But it's not fundamentally beyond revelation. He just doesn't, the students, the Makablim, don't have access to it. But for now, at least. So here's what he says. So what's the difference between the two in our context here? The b'chinas sosum be'etzem hari be'emes shayech el Pnimi davke. Umemenu nimtza Pnimi kamesh shekoseh b'malkam acher. Okay, I know this is going to throw us all up for a loop. What he says like this: that which is fundamentally concealed is really, be'emes, in truth, has a relationship with that which is internalized and revealed. Pnimi. Dafke. Umemena nimtza pnimi. And from there comes the pnimi that will be internalized. Okay. So now, let me explain this. Well, let me read another line and then I'll explain it. I just want to see where this parenthesis ends. 1 second. Oh, it ends another 2 lines. I'm going to read the whole parenthesis, then I'll explain. But what does that mean? How can you say that? If that which is concealed from us is removed from us, is something we can't access, the Mekablim, so that which is fundamentally concealed is definitely beyond us, completely unknowable. So what are you saying that is shaykh to Pnimi? And from there comes the Pnimi. So we need to explain what that means. So he says, Vastimus, this higher level of concealment, ein ze b'chinas helam. It's not a level of concealment. The fact that it's unknowable is not because it's been concealed. It's in a state that altogether does not relate to the parameters of concealment and revelation. As I said, I'll explain what this means. Vahainu, which this means in another parenthesis within a parenthesis, the be'er gufa hu madrega shalamayla b'chinas helam v'gilui. In Eid itself, it's a level that's higher than concealment and revelation. Be patient, I'll explain this shortly. The lower level, however, which is concealed from the recipients, is in a state of makif and concealment. So, counterintuitively and even paradoxically, the higher level of sosum, which is fundamentally unknowable or fundamentally closed up, is not a state of concealment. It's a state that is completely beyond concealment and revelation. So let me explain what this means. Well, and the conclusion of that would be, before I explain, that Yitzira then isn't just that it has a quality that it reveals, which is concealed in Bria, but Yitzira in some way associates with the deepest levels of Sosum Be'etzem, because that's where Pnimi comes from. Okay. So let me use, I'm going to try to find a few examples to explain this. When the Rashbi came out from the Myra, from the cave, after having to hide for 12 years, concealing himself, with his son Rabbi Lozer, so during the Romans, when they decreed that learning Torah was prohibited, and he broke the law, so he had to run away out of fear of them capturing him and killing him. So he hid for 12 years, in the cave, as we know, the Myra, and miraculously survived and was fed. But what did he do all the time? He was surrounded all the time by learning Torah. So he rose to very high spiritual levels, to the point that after 12 years, he had become so sublime that when he came back to civilization and he saw the pettiness of people, he couldn't tolerate it. He saw that they were involved in nonsense. And here he was on this deeply spiritual experience for 12 years. So it says whatever he looked at began to burn, whether literally or metaphorically. But the bottom line, his intense spiritual energy was causing everything to burn up. It's like when you have a person who's on a very high level, he's among people that are behaving in ways that are nonsense, petty, his lack of tolerance can actually destroys. Not to destroy, to punish them, but it's just such a heavy, intense light that the light overwhelms everything around it. So the Eibishter says to him, Hashem says, you're not ready to come back yet. Go back a 13th year, Bar Mitzvah year, where you gain another level of maturity, Bar Mitzvah, Because I don't want you to destroy my world. I want you to repair my world. And after the 13th year, it says that Rashbi, when he came back now to civilization, whatever he saw that was broken, he repaired. So instead of his intense light annihilating it, he repaired it. So let me ask you a question. Which is a higher level? A level of spirituality that is so powerful that it can't tolerate anything that's antithetical to it? Or the 13th year where you could tolerate, not just tolerate, but you can transform it. So initially we would think that he was higher after 12 years than 13 years, because 13 years, in a sense, he's not so intense. That's not correct. It's even deeper. When you see, for example, I remember, I'll just tell a story that happened with me. I was once on a panel, and there were quite a few, let's call it skeptics in the audience. And one of them asked a question of one of my colleagues, and it was a very provocative question. And my colleague began to argue with him. He was even offended. And they literally had like a real argument. It got a little nasty. Then it was my turn. So I, recognizing somewhat, I guess, the psyche of the skeptic, I responded far more calm. But obviously I explained the idea. So someone asked me afterwards, there was another person watching, he said, why is it that both of you didn't agree with this guy, but your colleague got into a fight with him and was offended, and for good reason? He said some things that were very offensive, about God, about Torah, and so on. And are you just more liberal-minded? Are you more like open-minded, so you're just more tolerant of a different opinion? The answer is, and I'm not here to toot my horn, I just wanted to explain so I said, no, not at all. I maybe disagree with that guy even more. But when you come to a point where you could understand, perhaps put yourself in the shoes of the skeptic, you don't become so engaged and you don't go down on his level. It's like almost, I don't want to compare it because I don't want to sound patronizing, but it's like if a little child came over to you and started kicking and screaming and scratching you, I would hope that you wouldn't get down on your hands and knees and start scratching back. Why? It's a child. If an adult would come over to you and insult you, that person's on your level. In other words, when you go to higher spiritual levels, it's not that you can tolerate more because you're more mature. It's that you are not impacted quite the same way by something that opposes you. So the point being is this: when you talk about Helem and Gilui, there are things that a teacher is teaching his students, and they're just not ready to hear a certain idea, so he has to conceal it. So he makes a deliberate effort that he's not going to say a few things because he doesn't want to confuse the students, because what he would say would overwhelm them. But there are other things that the teacher can convey that are beyond Helem and Gilui. There are things that are more atzmizdik. And even though the student may not understand it, but to say that it's being concealed, no, because it defies concealment and revelation. It's just like, let's say, the love of a parent or a teacher to students. The love can be even deeper than the secrets of ideas that he's not revealing. But the love in some way gets communicated, affects those students. So essentially what he's saying here is there's a level of Gilui. There's a level where the Gilui is concealed, a very deliberate effort of concealment. Then there's a state that's beyond concealment and beyond revelation. It's not bound by those terms altogether. So, for example, spirituality and materialism seem antithetical to one another. That's why the Rambam says that ultimate reward will be in Gan Eden. There'll be tchias hamesim, souls and bodies, for a period of time to reward the body for its participation in doing mitzvahs in this world. But ultimately, the soul can appreciate godliness much more than the body. If someone were to ask you, who's going to appreciate spirituality more, the soul or the body? Of course, the soul. The soul has more sublime tools. The body relates to things in the world of matter. But then we learn that godliness is higher than soul and body. God is not bound by soul and body. The soul and the body are going to have a conflict with each other. But godliness is beyond both. And that's why he can create both. Because God is not antithetical to matter, just as he's not antithetical, is as distant from soul as he is from body. So in other words, the higher you go, you get to a point that's not a deeper level of concealment, it's a level that's beyond concealment. So that's why we say, for example, that the levels of Atzilus cannot be revealed in this world. Because if they were revealed, the world would not be able to exist, like Rashbi after 12 years. Atzmus is right here. Why is he right here? If Atzilus can't be here, how could Atzmus be here? Because Atzilus is a Gilui. A Gilui, and in a place that's not fitting, it can't exist. That's why you're not supposed to learn Torah in certain places, because it's not a keli for godliness. But Etzem is not bound by keli and Ur. It's not bound by Helam and Gilui, so it could be everywhere. And at the same time, it's nowhere. What do I mean by nowhere? It's not, because it doesn't occupy space quite the same way. So spiritual space and material space conflict with each other to some extent, because they have different personalities. Divine space is beyond spiritual space, and that is not bound by the rules of Helam and Gilui. It's like the Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya, in the same Arich of All Worlds that he mentioned before, actually. Arich of All Worlds, chapter 9. So he says you could speak about God and say that God is beyond anything that's that is sensory. So in other words, you can't touch God because God is beyond the senses. But then he says there's a level of God that's even beyond being beyond the senses. For example, he gives an example. Imagine saying, Chachma, wisdom, your hands can't touch it. He says anyone who says that will be laughed at. It's completely not in the gather of Mishush. You could say in the world of the physical, there are things I can touch, there are things I can't touch. I can touch, let's say, the outer level of something, I can't touch the subatomic particles. But in a world that's completely beyond the world of touch, you don't say Chachma, wisdom, is so beyond us that you can't touch wisdom. In other words, it's not, you can't even negate the fact because it's not even in that realm. And the same thing with Eibishter. To say that Eibishter cannot be touched is like saying he's not in that world altogether. Helam and Gilui come from the same reality. One is revealed and one is concealed. And those are stages of development. But he's saying Sosum Be'etzem is a level that in Ur is beyond revelation and beyond concealment. It's a Atzmi. It's like Ur Atzmi. He calls it Ur, not Etzem, for a reason, because it still manifests, but it manifests in a way that's completely beyond. And that's why he says it has a shaykh to Pnimi, because it's not more distant from the Pnimi than the Makif. Makif and Pnimi, meaning the lower level of Makif, Sasum, L'gabe HaMakablim, there, it's hidden from us, a hidden state. This level is beyond being hidden, and therefore has a shaykh la Pnimi, he says, those words, and Momena Nimtza Pnimi. So how do you explain Nimtza Pnimi? Because the Tachlis HaKavana in the highest levels is that it should come Begili. So really, like we say, Seif Ma'aser B'machshavat Chila, the end process that it should be revealed is the intention. When the potter is shaping the clay, so even when he's in that raw state, his intention is that it should give it shape and form, and then finish the product, and you'll have an object. So in his most primordial state, even higher than Bria, higher than the Chemer, Pashut, if you're going all the way back to the core, in his own inner essence, the potter or the artist or whatever wants the Gilui. But the process of creation has to go through first Helam, then a little Gilui in Yetzirah, and then more Gilui and more developed in details in Asiya. But in his intention is higher than Helam and Gilui. So on the level of Sosum Be'etzem, we're talking about the inner intention, there the Kavanah is Gilui. And that's why the Pnimi ultimately, because if you would stick only to the level, everything began in the world of Bria, who says it's going to come revealed? Maybe it's going to remain concealed. But since it's all originates from a place that's higher than Bria, all the way to what we're calling now Ephes, he doesn't say efes, but all the way to the higher levels of sasum be'etzem, therefore there, Pnimi is ultimately the kavanah, like he said, Gilui is the kavanah that it should be revealed. However, you can't get to revealed state if you don't go through the stages of concealment. So basically is this, the teacher be'etzem loves his student and wants to teach the student. He wants the student to understand. So therefore, there are two things going on. From the core essence of the teacher, that's Helen be'etzem, he wants the student to have a Gilui. But in the actual process, the student can't understand it all. So the student has to first go through something that's more concealed, a little less concealed, more revealed, more revealed. But the end product, the Gilui, is ultimately what the Sasam Be'etzem really intended in the first place. That's how I would explain this parentheses and what the Rebbe Rashab is saying here, which of course adds a lot to the whole topic that we're discussing. But again, very dense. It's in just a few lines, but it's very clear where he's going with this. Yeah. Okay, so that was a mouthful. So before I continue, I'll stop if anybody wants clarification or explanation of what I just said.
Why is the Pnimi more important to the Sasum Be'etzem? I know he wants the Gilui.
It's like asking because he wants a dira b'tachtenim, he wants Gilui Elikus in this world, not in Atzilus, not in Bria. If the concept of Gilui is a shlemus, if someone says, I potentially have the power to be a Gaon, a scholar. So the Alter Rebbe said to him, just like a Ganef is not someone who potentially can be a Ganef, but someone who actually is, so too a Gaon is not someone who could be, but has to be. Basically, shlemus, the way Hashem created it, is Gilui, is the completion of something. To say I'm a good person at heart, but it never comes out revealed, is not the kavanah. So ultimately, kavanah has to be that it's actually going to be revealed. However, you can't begin with a total revelation. Because you could also ask, why didn't Rashbi right away go to 13 years? There's an inyan in having a Gilui that defies the Helam that defies a Gilui, and there's and then there's even a deeper level where you transform.
May I ask a question?
I mean, this does go back, with one qualification, this goes back to the theme of Helam Atzmi, if you remember, that we reach through the distress in this world. But there, you were talking about hitting rock bottom, meaning really no revelation at all. Here we're talking in Torah. Remember, Talmud and Mishnah is in Torah. So even in Oyer, there's a level of this Helam Be'etzem. So Helam Atzmi that we learned earlier is even higher than Oyer. Here he's speaking in Oyer, there's an element of a Helam like that. Bottom line is, you want to have a relationship with God on all levels. We need Gilui, we need Helam Makif, and we need Helam Be'etzem, like Sasam Be'etzem. Then you have all the levels covered.
Rabbi, it almost sounds like to me, I'm sorry.
Hold on. In Vayigash, in the Sikha Vayigash Chelik Hey, the second Sikha, where the Rebbe says that the Chiddush, that Atzmus, if it doesn't come Begili, is lacking something, is not complete, is also very connected to this. Gilui, in other words, is not incidental. It's not like saying, oh, I have it all, but it's just not revealed. No, revelation is the final step. The Rebbe has a beautiful sikh also about it, Noyach Tafshin Lamed Ches, after the heart attack. The Rebbe has a beautiful sikh, that the mila of something is that it should come revealed, not just remain in a concealed state. Okay, so 1 second. I know a bunch of you have questions.
Which chelik is this in Noach? Which chelik?
Noach Sikh is printed in Chelik Chof in the Hesofis 20. So you'll see Noach Tafshin Lamed Ches. A very interesting piece about the Maila of Gilui Helam, even Legabe Dira B'Tachtenim. So Dira B'Tachtenim is bringing a Dira below, but you also need to have Legales to Megala. In other words, there's the two reasons when the Neshama comes down below. So sometimes it says that the Neshama, in Tanya says, the Neshama didn't come down for Tikkun Atzmei. The Neshama doesn't need it. It only comes to transform the body and the material world. But then in some places it says that the Neshama elevates when it comes down. You did it Tzedek Aliyah, because the keiches of the Neshama that were in Lamaila would never have been revealed except if it came in this world. So the Rebbe explains these two aspects. That one is taka to transform a lower level, but another is also to be revealed and reveal all its potential. Okay, let's go. I know a few questions. Who wants to? I think Svi wanted to say. Is that someone else?
I think I'm starting to understand the difference between. I mean, I couldn't understand the difference between, Ratzon above the Tzimtzum and Sason, but now I think I understand it. It's like when we discussed in Bereshit, God had a drive to make a Ratzon to create the world. It was like that early stage before anything even he had a Ratzon. That would be the Sason, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't want to associate it with any particular level, but essentially, an etzem is not bound by Helam and Gilui, because an etzem can be there, whether it's concealed or not concealed, is not subject to the rules of concealment and revelation. So if you find any level that we learned about that is beyond those two levels, that's similar to the Sasum Be'etzem. Once you get into the process of revealed and concealed, you're already talking relative to each other. No, it's Helam and Gilui are closer to each other than Etzem is, because Etzem is beyond them both. Like I mentioned about the numbers, infinite numbers and finite numbers are a contradiction, even though all finite is equal compared to the infinite, but they're both in the set of numbers. When you say something that doesn't even value numbers altogether, they're both equal. It doesn't matter. It's not, I don't care if it's finite or infinite. Like when we say God has the power to create the infinite, the finite, just like he has the power to create the infinite, because he's neither of the two. Is infinity closer to Elokus than finite? So most people would say, yeah, because infinite is much higher. Yeah, yes, in the world of Giluyim, infinite is more magnitude. There's much more, it's infinite. It doesn't have any limits. So it's definitely more Gilui in that sense. But when you talk about the Etzem, who says the finite is less of an expression of the divine than the infinite? So the same idea, finite and infinite, like Helam and Gilui. I'm just using it as an example. It's not exactly, but somewhat like that. So when you say Makif and Pnimi, is Makif and Pnimi, Igulim and Yeshem. But what about the Makif Be'etzem? Is not because it's a Makif, it's because it's beyond this whole, it's not in this realm, it's not in this domain, it's not subject to the whole discussion. Like I said, Chochmah, you can't say, I could touch it with my hands, I can't touch it with my hands. It's not in that realm, it's not in the world of touch.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah. So could you say, I mean, it's hard to put this into human words, but that this level in Etzem is beyond the level of Gilui, where if like, for example, if you understand something, it's so internalized to the point where it's past the point of internalization, where it's super conscious on a level that you can't even explain it because it's beyond words, but it's after it's revealed and it's internalized.
Yes, you could say that.
I'm trying to, okay.
Yes, you could say that. And that's, of course, a very advanced stage. When Mashiach comes, that's what we say, that the Etzem will be Begilui. That we will be able to, what we today can appreciate only, let's say we can only appreciate outer levels, we'll be able to appreciate, like when we say, there will no longer be a garment that will conceal the teacher, your eye, and the eye, your eyes will see, the eyes will see Esmerecha, your teacher. Today we need garments, we need something to conceal because the light is too intense. It's like Moshe Rabbeinu had to cover his face for us to look at his face. Or like you say, God can't be seen and we live. But then there comes a point where the Pnimi can actually experience the Etzem, but that requires all the work of refining ourselves to the point that first we can receive that which is concealed, and then we can receive levels that are even beyond. And then there's something that connects the highest and the lowest in a very profound way. Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? This is a deep piece. I'm not going to suggest that if you still eludes you, just read it again and just review it. It takes time to understand this because it's a complicated concept. But if you think about it, you'll see it makes a lot of sense, especially when you understand the levels. I gave some examples of it.
It's a little hard to understand by Atzmus. Why is the Gilui the Shleimus? Why does he need the Gilui?
Well, do you understand why he wants a dira b'tachtenim? The Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu. There is no why. That's what he desired. And he made that a shleimus. And how do we know? Because we see in this world, Gilui is a shleimus. But Mela, it's a shleimus also l'mayla. That's what the Eibishter wanted. He doesn't need anything, but he wanted it. And once he wants it, there's a logic to it. It all begins because the Eibishter wanted it and desired that. There's no explanation on that level. It's a better question. The whole idea of explanations and seichel, God also created. So seichel cannot tell you why God created seichel. He could have created seichel in a very different way. He could have said that Helam is better than Gilui, but he didn't do it that way. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, that the world, the seichel of the world, the way it is right now, is exactly the way the Eibishter wanted it to be. So that means the way it is, that's how he desired it. And once he desired this type of seichel, that's how it is. The rules that we have in rules of logic were created. They didn't have to be created this way, but what they are, these are the rules. We'll never understand why Dafka 10 spheres, why weren't there 20 spheres or 25? Fundamentally, that's a question you could always ask. But the Eibishter chose that. And once he chose it, there's a logic behind it. Okay? In the Sikha Vayetze Memches, where the Rebbe explained Derech Hamuna, that was Behemshech to Hey Tevis, when they published Derech Hamuna, the Rebbe talks about this point, that spheres, the Eibishter wanted there should be 10 spheres, and once he wanted it, that's the logic. So this is a theme, a pretty recurrent theme, especially in the later years, in many of the Rebbe Sikhs. So I would check out that sikh. He brings from the Rebbe Marash, from the Rebbe Rashab, l'shenas that are very, very, very unique in this context. That once the Eibishter wanted, that is the way it is established. Like, why do we say kosher kekriyas yamsuf? It's difficult for God to part the sea? No. But once he created the rules of sea and land and the rules of nature, even kav yochel for Hashem, as he manifests in existence, is kosher. Of course, when you're talking from the root of it all, nothing is difficult. Land and sea, they both are completely, there are no rules. And the land could be sea, he doesn't need to have a wind that pulls the sea back like a wall. Could have done whatever he wants. But the Eibishter created it, and therefore lo yushbeisu, this is how he wants it, because this in some way reflects his deepest nesava. Yes, can he defy the laws of nature? Of course he does. That's a nes. But even when he defies the laws of nature, he doesn't do it completely. Even Kriyas Yamsuf, the biggest miracle, he made it with a wind. What do you need a wind for? The Eibishter could have just said, people walk through the water and that's it, then nothing happens to them. Well, he didn't even have to make the water move. He could have made them walk through water. So they'll get wet, but they won't drown. The point being, because everything ultimately is somewhat in the rules of existence once those rules were established. But there's always a level that's beyond it all, obviously. You know, it reminds me of, I don't want to use the example of Superman, but we can't see through a wall, right? Because eyesight has limitations, and you can only see through transparent objects. If there's a solid wall, you can't see through it. X-ray vision can see through. Why? Because X-rays have an ability, they're not defined by Helam and Gilui, like, for example, our regular eyesight is. So an X-ray can pierce even a surface level because it's a different level of light that's not subject to the same thing. The wall won't conceal it. I'm just giving an example of something that can transcend the usual limitations of, let's say, light. Light can't go through certain objects. Certain light could go through certain objects. So you have to say that light is not defined by the regular ebb and flow or the regular concealment and revelation of those rules. Yeah. Okay, let's stop here. The bottom of page, the one word on the page, top of the third.